How successful was U.S. containment? In this presentation, I will be focusing on answering this question based on the U.S. interference in the Vietnam War. To begin, what were the U.S.'s reasons for entering the war in the first place? Well, President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State Jeff Dulles were positive that China and the USSR had plans to spread communism throughout Asia. This would be known as the Domino Theory. Basically, President Eisenhower and Jeff Dulles thought that if Vietnam became communist, its neighboring countries of Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, and India would also fall to communism, just like dominoes. There's also another reason as to why the US entered war, but this reason is highly debatable. This reason is that powerful groups in the US wanted war, as the US government gave great budgets to military commanders, and these budgets would be spent on big American businesses to manufacture weapons. Ergo, the armed forces and the big companies would both profit from the Vietnam War. Next, let's discuss how the US fought during the Vietnam War. Their tactics can be divided into 4 central groups: bombing, search and destroy, chemical weapons, and US troops. Let's begin with bombing. Bombing was the main US tactic, and to an extent, it was actually successful. US bombing harmed North Vietnam's war effort and interrupted their supply routes, as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a major supply route for the North Vietnamese troops. Furthermore, from the years 1970 to 1972, the intense bombing put upon North Vietnam forced peace negotiations. Despite the fact that the bombing was vigorous, it could not actually abolish the spread of communism. It could only delay their activity. For example, in the year of 1972, the Viet Cong were still able to execute a major assault on South Vietnam. Moreover, the bombing also helped communism gain more support within Vietnam, as the Vietnamese people were turning against the Americans and South Vietnamese for all the bombing that had been done to them. Now, search and destroy. Search and destroy missions were used to directly combat against the Viet Cong's guerrilla warfare. Near the South Vietnamese coasts, heavily armed U.S. bases would send off helicopters brimmed with troops, and they would set off to a village. And as the title of the tactic suggests, they would search and destroy any Viet Cong forces they found. Even though these search and destroy missions would kill Viet Cong troops, problems arose. Starting off, some of these raids were based on very little information. Therefore, villages consisting of no Viet Cong forces would often become targets. Secondly, inexperienced troops would often fall into traps. Also, just like the bombing, search and destroy missions made the U.S. and South Vietnam forces very unpopular among the North Vietnamese, specifically the peasants, so they would drift to supporting the Viet Cong. As for the U.S. tactic of chemical weapons, there are 2 major ones. First, there's Agent Orange. Agent Orange was sprayed from planes onto Vietnamese jungles where suspected guerrilla fighters hid. The U.S. forces used 82 million liters of Agent Orange on thousands of square kilometers of Vietnamese jungles. And on a side note, Vietnam and plenty of other Vietnam War veterans are still experiencing Agent Orange's toxic side effects today. Then, there's napalm. Napalm bombs were chemical weapons that would be able to burn the clothes and skin all the way up to the bone of an individual. Napalm bombs would also be dropped from planes onto Vietnamese jungles where suspected guerrilla fighters would be hidden. Finally, there are the U.S. troops. The U.S. troops' success is split. In the beginning of the war, the U.S. troops would mainly consist of well-skilled and professional soldiers. However, this changed when the war escalated, as the need for more and more troops grew more and more desperate. In response, the U.S. implemented the use of conscripts. Because of this, issues arose. Due to the conscripts, many of the troops just left school or college. In fact, the average age of U.S. troops was only 19 years old. Not only were the conscripts inexperienced in the military itself, They were unfamiliar with Vietnam, and they were not interested in fighting for democracy against communism. And going back to search and destroy missions, the inexperienced troops would often fall into traps. To put it simply, they just wanted to return home alive. Now, what were the U.S.'s reasons for withdrawal in the Vietnam War? Before answering this, let's take a look at the Tet Offensive. In 1968, the Viet Cong attacked over 100 cities and other military bases and attempted to overtake the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Around 4,500 Viet Cong fighters controlled U.S. and South Vietnamese forces for 2 days. This attack brought along discussions about U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, such as, if the U.S. was spending $20 billion a year in the Vietnam War, how is it possible that the Viet Cong forces could overtake them? And, even though the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces rapidly retook their territory after the Tet Offensive, the cost of this was very great. Thousands and thousands of lives were lost. To give you an idea, 10,000 Viet Cong members passed away, and hefty amounts of artillery and air power were used, and the ancient city of Hue was completely devastated by the attack. Was this okay? Not only was it the Tet Offensive that influenced U.S. withdrawal from the war, but the opposition of the war in the U.S. was also influential. Because of the war, much money was being spent on the war rather than back home in the U.S., which greatly upset Americans, even more so that the U.S. showed no real signs of winning. The conscription also exposed racial inequality, since 30% of African Americans had been drafted, compared to the 19% of white Americans who had been drafted. Plus, the Vietnam War was all over the media. Television, newspapers, radios, every platform was outwardly showing the atrocities of the Vietnam War, and this made Americans very uncomfortable. Anti-war protests of the U.S. reached its peak between the years of 1968 and 1970, and it was made very clear by the anti-war Americans that Johnson was not supported by them at all. After the Tet Offensive, President Johnson reduced the bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and he told his officials to start negotiating for peace. When Johnson announced that he would not be seeking re-election as president, it was basically an admission of failure. In November 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president, and by January 1973, all parties signed a peace agreement, which meant that Nixon was now able to pull out all the U.S. troops from Vietnam soil. On the 29th of March, 1973, the last U.S. forces left Vietnam. After 2 years without U.S. help, the South Vietnamese had been overtaken by the communists. To finish off, let's go back to the question in the opening. If you remember, the question was, how successful was U.S. containment? Well, after the Vietnam War, the American policy of containment was in ruins. There are 3 central categories of how the policy of containment failed. It failed militarily, as it showed that despite the U.S.'s strong military, they could not contain the spread of communism. It also failed strategically, as the U.S. had failed to stop South Vietnam from turning communist, and the vigorous bombings inflicted on Vietnam's neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia caused them to support the Viet Cong, and both became communist countries in the year of 1975. Lastly, the violence the U.S. committed backfired on them. The U.S. had presented their policy of containment to be a fight for democracy. However, their violence in Vietnam seemed to others to not be a fight for democracy. This greatly harmed the U.S.'s reputation. To summarize things up, U.S. containment was not very successful because in the Vietnam War, the U.S. tactics backfired on their reputation, strengthened the anti-war spirit of Americans back home, and increased the number of Vietnamese and neighboring countries who supported the Viet Cong. Despite the huge sum of money that was spent on the military, it could still not defeat the Viet Cong. In the end, the US ultimately failed to achieve their goal of containment in Vietnam, and that is why the US containment policy in Vietnam was not successful.